They say home is where you should feel safest. But what happens when the very people meant to protect your neighborhood turn into your worst nightmare? One homeowner thought they were simply putting up a harmless decoration, a small act of joy in their own yard. But within days, it spiraled into fines, threats, and something far darker, an accusation so outrageous it could destroy their family. How far can an HOA go before it stops being about rules and starts being about power? Stay with me, because this story will make you question everything you thought you knew about community. At first glance, the neighborhood looked like the kind of place people dreamed of living. Wide streets lined with neatly trimmed hedges, driveways free of clutter, and homes so uniform they felt almost copied and pasted. For most, that sameness was a comfort. For families like the Parkers, it was supposed to mean safety, stability, and a place to finally put down roots. The Parkers were like any other family. James worked long hours as a mechanic while his wife, Elena, kept the household running and raised their 2 kids. Their joy came from simple things: bike rides down the cul-de-sac, weekend barbecues, and the pride of finally owning a home they had saved for years to afford. It was modest, but it was theirs. At first, the HOA felt like background noise, meeting reminders in the mailbox, the occasional newsletter about landscaping or recycling rules. Nothing more than the expected bureaucracy of a tidy community. But neighbors whispered about board members who watched too closely, fines that arrived without warning, and rules that seemed to shift like quicksand. The Parkers didn't pay much attention. They were focused on living, not politics. Still, there were small signs, an odd glare from the board president when James parked his truck a little too close to the curb, or a note about their garden hose being left out overnight. Minor annoyances, they thought, until one decision, one simple act in their own yard, would pull them into a storm they never saw coming. At first, the Parker family brushed off the little warnings and notes from the HOA. A hose left on the lawn, a truck parked a few inches off the driveway line. Annoyances, sure, but nothing worth losing sleep over. James figured everyone got them at some point. Elena laughed it off, tossing the notices into a drawer, telling him they're just doing their job. But the drawers started to fill, and with each letter, the language got harsher, colder, and more threatening. It began with fines. $50 for the truck, $75 for the hose, then $100 for the children's bikes left in the yard, even though they had only been there for an afternoon. At first, James paid them, frustrated but eager to avoid conflict. But the fines kept coming, and the numbers grew. Soon it was $200 here, $300 there, with vague accusations of noncompliance. James asked to see the rules, to understand what exactly they had done wrong. What he received was a packet so thick it looked more like a law book than neighborhood guidelines. And inside, buried in legal jargon, were rules so specific it felt impossible not to break them. One regulation stated that grass had to be cut no longer than 2 inches at any time. Another banned unapproved exterior items, which could mean anything from a basketball hoop to a wind chime. Even the paint color of their garden shed was suddenly up for scrutiny, despite being approved when they first moved in. It was as though the HOA had turned their family into a target. Elena started to notice it too. She would see the board president, a sharp-faced woman named Carol, standing at the end of their driveway during her morning walks, staring at their home like she was taking mental notes. Neighbors whispered that Carol had it out for the Parkers, though no one dared say it too loudly. In a community run by the HOA, stepping out of line could make you the next victim. The harassment escalated. The family received a notice claiming their fence was too tall, despite being the exact same height as every other fence on the street. A violation was issued for visible clutter when James left his toolbox near the garage for a single afternoon. Even their mailbox was flagged for being non-standard, though it had been installed by the developer years before the HOA board even existed. James decided to fight back. He attended an HOA meeting, thinking he could reason with them. But the meeting was a spectacle. As he tried to speak, Carol cut him off repeatedly, dismissing his concerns with a smile that never touched her eyes. Other board members nodded along, acting as though everything was by the book. When James pressed for explanations, Carol leaned forward and said, If you don't like it here, perhaps this isn't the right community for your family. Gasps filled the room. It wasn't just about rules anymore. It was personal. Back home, Elena begged James to let it go. But James couldn't shake the feeling that if they surrendered now, it would only get worse. The HOA had crossed from governance into harassment. And worse, the fines had ballooned into thousands of dollars, with threats of liens against their property if they didn't comply. The house they had worked their whole lives to afford, the home they wanted to pass down to their children, was suddenly at risk of being taken away. Then came the breaking point. One afternoon, James returned from work to find a letter taped directly to their front door. It wasn't a notice or even a fine. It was a warning. Failure to comply will result in enforcement actions, including but not limited to property seizure. The words burned in his hands as he read them. Enforcement actions? Property seizure? It felt like a threat straight out of a mob movie. As if that weren't enough, the family began to feel watched. A neighbor mentioned seeing a board member photographing their yard late at night. Another swore they saw Carol driving slowly past the house, phone in hand, snapping pictures. Elena started closing the blinds during the day, too unnerved to let the children play freely outside. The house that was supposed to be their safe haven now felt like a cage, every move under surveillance. James's frustration turned to determination. He began documenting everything, every notice, every fine, every odd photograph he caught being taken. He consulted with a lawyer, only to learn that fighting an HOA was a costly, uphill battle. The board had deep pockets, funded by the very dues homeowners like him paid. Still, James refused to back down. He attended more meetings, asked harder questions, and filed formal complaints. Each time, Carol's smile grew sharper, her voice more venomous. Then came the accusation that shocked the entire neighborhood. During a routine HOA inspection, Carol claimed to have found a safety hazard in the Parkers' yard. A broken gate latch, she said, that could endanger children walking by. But instead of simply issuing a violation, the board reported the Parkers to local authorities for endangering community safety. The Parkers were stunned. A broken latch? Something James could fix in 10 minutes with a screwdriver? Now, it was being painted as a criminal act. Though the authorities quickly dismissed the claim, the damage was done. Neighbors looked at the family differently. Whispers followed them down the street, and the HOA acted as though their accusations had been validated. The tension reached a boiling point during one final confrontation. At yet another board meeting, James stood up with a folder full of evidence, photographs, receipts, and copies of the ever-changing rules. He laid them out on the table, his voice steady, but his hands shaking. "This isn't about rules," he said. "This is about control, and we won't be bullied out of our home." Carol leaned back, her smile fading for the first time. The room was silent. Then, without warning, she said the words that sent chills through the room. "If you think you can outlast us, you're wrong. We always win." That night, James and Elena sat in their kitchen, surrounded by papers and unpaid fines. Their children slept upstairs, unaware of how close they were to losing everything. James promised his wife he wouldn't give up, but deep down, he wondered if they had already lost. The next morning, the Parkers discovered something on their lawn that would change everything. It was no longer just about money or rules. It was about survival. The Parker family thought they had seen it all, the fines, the threats, the constant surveillance. But nothing prepared them for the night. Everything came crashing down. It started with a pounding on the door. Not a knock, a pounding. James opened it to find two sheriff's deputies standing on the porch, hands on their belts. Behind them, Carol, the HOA president, stood smirking in the glow of the streetlight, a clipboard clutched to her chest like a badge of authority. The deputies handed James a document. "You've been served," one said flatly. It was a lawsuit, filed by the HOA, claiming the Parkers had violated over 24 rules and now owed tens of thousands of dollars in unpaid fines. Worse, tucked inside was a motion for foreclosure. The home they had worked so hard for, the one place their children felt safe, was suddenly at risk of being ripped away. Elena's knees buckled as she read the papers. James's blood boiled. Carol didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her smile said everything. To her, this was the kill shot. But James wasn't ready to surrender. He called his lawyer, who assured him that while the HOA had power, their case was built on sand. Still, it meant court. It meant exposing their lives, their finances, and their family to public scrutiny. The Parkers were terrified, but James knew it was their only chance. The courtroom was packed the day of the hearing. Neighbors filled the benches, some curious, others there to quietly cheer for the HOA. Carol sat at the front with her board members, dressed as if for a coronation, certain she was about to deliver the final blow. The HOA's attorney went first, rattling off violation after violation, holding up photographs of the Parkers' yard, their fence, their driveway. Each infraction sounded more absurd than the last. The grass was an eighth of an inch too long. The mailbox had faded paint. A child's bike left on the lawn constituted obstruction. The audience chuckled at first, but then the sheer volume of charges turned those chuckles into uneasy silence. The case looked suffocating, overwhelming. Then it was James's turn. He rose, clutching the folder he had been building for months. His lawyer guided him, but it was James's voice, raw with emotion, that cut through the courtroom. One by one, he displayed the HOA's notices, each contradicting the last. He showed photographs of identical fences and mailboxes in the neighborhood, untouched by enforcement. He revealed emails where Carol herself had shifted deadlines, moved goalposts, and threatened escalating consequences. And then came the moment that shifted the room. James produced a recording, one he had captured during an HOA meeting months earlier. The audio crackled, but Carol's voice was unmistakable. "If you think you can outlast us, you're wrong. We always win." The words hung in the air like a bomb. The judge leaned forward. The room went silent. And for the first time, Carol's confidence faltered. James pressed on, his voice rising with every word. "This isn't about rules. This is about intimidation. It's about control. And it's about one person's obsession with power." His hands trembled, but his eyes were locked on Carol's. "We are not perfect neighbors, but we are human beings. And no one, no board, no association, has the right to destroy a family's life just to feed their ego." The HOA's attorney scrambled, objecting, trying to steer the narrative back to the violations. But the damage was done. The judge demanded explanations for the selective enforcement, the contradictory rules, and the tone of Carol's recorded threat. Each answer from the HOA side dug the hole deeper. Carol tried to speak, insisting that the board had acted within its authority, but her composure cracked. Her voice wavered, her face flushed, and soon her carefully cultivated image of control collapsed under the weight of her own arrogance. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering to one another. The woman who once ruled the cul-de-sac with iron confidence now looked cornered, desperate. The tension broke when the judge slammed down his gavel. "Enough," he said sharply. His words carried the weight of finality. He announced that the foreclosure motion was denied. The majority of fines were dismissed as unenforceable, and he referred the HOA board for review by state oversight committees, citing evidence of abuse of power and possible fraud. Gasps filled the room. Carol's face drained of color. James sat down, his hands covering his face as Elena squeezed his shoulder, tears streaming down her cheeks. It wasn't complete victory. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned in their favor. As they left the courtroom, the Parkers passed neighbors who had once avoided them, now nodding in quiet respect. Carol remained seated, motionless, staring at the table in front of her. For the first time, she wasn't in control. But the fight had come at a cost. The Parkers still faced debt from legal fees, fractured relationships in the neighborhood, and a lingering fear of what retaliation might follow. Yet for that moment, for the first time in months, they felt something they had nearly forgotten: hope. And just when James thought the storm had passed, he returned home that evening to find something waiting on his lawn. Not a letter, not a notice. Something far more chilling. A reminder that the battle with the HOA wasn't over yet. The night after the courtroom battle, the Parker home was quieter than it had been in months. No pounding on the door, no late-night surveillance cars idling outside, no stack of fresh violation notices taped to the mailbox. For the first time in what felt like forever, James and Elena tucked their children in a bed with the fragile sense that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare was beginning to end. But hope is a cautious thing. On the front lawn, where their children once played freely, James found a small cardboard box waiting at dawn. No label, no handwriting, just a plain box set neatly against the porch. His gut twisted as he opened it. Inside was a collection of shredded notices, fines, violations, and warnings, all torn into strips, mixed with dirt and dead leaves. It wasn't the HOA's usual paperwork. It was a message, a reminder that even though the Parkers had won a victory in court, the war at home was far from over. James stood there, clutching the box, wondering if this was Carol's last attempt to rattle them, or if someone else on the board, emboldened by her downfall, had decided to carry the torch. Either way, it hardened his resolve. This was not the end of their fight, but it was the start of their recovery. In the weeks that followed, the HOA board fractured. Carol, once untouchable, resigned under pressure after the judge's referral for state investigation. Neighbors who had once nodded in quiet agreement with her rules now avoided her completely. Some whispered that she had moved out of the community entirely, retreating to escape the humiliation. For the Parkers, it was a strange feeling watching the woman who had tormented them dissolve into silence. But victory came with scars. The family's finances were battered by attorney fees and months of lost work hours. James often lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how close they had come to losing everything. Elena struggled with anxiety, flinching at every unexpected knock on the door, fearing another ambush. Their children, once carefree, asked why their neighbors didn't invite them over anymore. The HOA had been beaten, but the damage ran deeper than anyone could see. And yet, something shifted in the neighborhood. A group of homeowners began attending board meetings for the first time, emboldened by James's stand. They asked questions, challenged vague rules, and demanded transparency. For years, people had been too afraid to speak, worried they would be targeted like the Parkers. But now, they had seen that standing up was possible. One evening, a neighbor approached James in the driveway. He was an older man, quiet and polite, someone James had barely spoken to in the past. With hesitation, the man admitted that he too had been fined for ridiculous infractions, but had paid them in silence to avoid conflict. "You did what the rest of us were too scared to do," he said softly. "You showed us they're not untouchable." It was then James realized that their battle had grown beyond their own home. It had become a story about something bigger, the abuse of power, the price of silence, and the courage to fight back even when the odds are stacked against you. Months passed, and the Parkers slowly rebuilt their sense of peace. The liens were cleared, the foreclosure attempt erased, and their property stood safe. Elena returned to her gardening, reclaiming the joy she had once found in the soil. Their children rode bikes again, though James still caught himself glancing down the street, scanning for watching eyes. The HOA, now under temporary oversight, became cautious and restrained. Fines dropped sharply, and rules were clarified. The atmosphere in the community shifted from one of fear to one of wary relief. People began to talk openly about their frustrations, no longer whispering in hushed tones. The board meetings, once sparsely attended rubber stamps for Carol's decisions, were now crowded with voices demanding accountability. Still, the Parker family carried the weight of what they had endured. They had seen how easily ordinary lives could be upended by the hunger for power disguised as neighborhood rules. They had watched friends turn into enemies, neighbors into spies, and a home into a battlefield. And yet, through